Hello, I'm Floyd Brown, and I'm the publisher of westernjournal.com. And is everybody having a great time? Come on, I want to hear more than that. Is everybody having a great time? Well, if you look around, you're going to see some round buttons that I don't have on right now, but they're the 10-year buttons. They're for those of us who have come to more than 10 Freedom Fests. And I can't believe I've been to more than 10, but how many of you, is there anybody in this room who's been to more than 10? All right, let's give those people a round of applause. Yeah, I think it's absolutely one of the best conferences every year, and that's why I come back time and time again. Well, Daily Variety has labeled him a firebrand. He is heard on over 300 radio stations from coast to coast. He's a lawyer, he's an author, but most of all, he's a legendary radio broadcaster. Let me welcome to the microphone the sage of South Central LA, Mr. Larry Elder.
Afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I think this is my third Freedom Fest. And my talk today is about race relations. Whether or not things are getting better, things are getting worse, are we headed towards some sort of racial riot? I have an ex-friend who changed his name from Perry to Abdul. I've known him since the second grade. He changed his name because he no longer wanted to be associated, quote, with the Christian religion that justified slavery, close quote. I informed him that the Arab slave trade started in the 9th century, continued about 300 years after the European slave trade ended. So you're talking about Arab slave trade lasting about 13 centuries, whereas the European slave trade lasted about 3 centuries. And you've changed your name to an Arab name because you no longer want to be associated with the religion that was associated with slavery? I told him that when you look at the slaves that were taken out of Africa, Arab slavers took more slaves out of Africa and transported them to South America and to the Middle East than did European slavers take slaves out of Africa and take them to North America. In fact, when you look at all the slaves that were taken to the New World, 30% of them were taken to Brazil. A large share were taken to the Caribbean countries and South America. Less than 4% of the slaves taken out of Africa and transported to the New World came to the 13 colonies, what ultimately became America. He told me that I was relying on white historians, and I was full of it. I said, is Henry Louis Gates white, the head of the African American Studies Department at Harvard? Look at his research. He's the one who said that he was surprised, was shocked, when he began learning about slavery to find out that Europeans enslaved Europeans. The word slave was derived from the term Slavic, referring to Caucasians who were enslaved. Asians enslaved Asians. Blacks enslaved blacks. What we call Native Americans enslaved Native Americans. Unfortunately, freedom is relatively the new kid on the block. Through all of human history, slavery has been going on. In fact, it's going on right now in Mauritania, Chad, Ghana, and other parts of the world. He told me, again, that I was full of it. I said, is Tom Sowell full of it? Thomas Sowell has written an amazing trilogy. He went around the world a couple times, examined virtually every culture that ever existed, and talked about the effect of where they live, geography, culture, and talked about the importance of culture. When President Barack Obama got elected in 2008, the first black person to be elected in a majority white country, and got reelected. In fact, when Obama gave a speech to a historically black college when he was a senator, he said that the generation of MLK, the Moses generation, has gotten us 90% of the way there. My generation, he said, the Joshua generation, has to get us the other 10%. I thought that was pretty reasonable. Fast forward, he becomes president. What does Obama tell us? Racism is in America's DNA. If racism were in America's DNA, it would be impossible for him to become president. If you look at polls in the 1950s, ask white people would they ever support a black person for president, irrespective of how qualified he or she is. The people that said yes were in the single digits. Obama got a higher percentage of the white vote than did John Kerry. The idea that racism remains a major problem in America is nonsense. It is pushed by the left, in my opinion, because they need to have that 95% monolithic black vote, that angry black vote without which they cannot succeed. Eric Holder, Obama's Attorney General, gave a speech in which he talked about the pernicious racism, which he said was every bit as bad as the old racism. In his speech, he gave 3 examples of what he called pernicious racism. Example number 1, the push on the part of many states for photo voter ID. He called that an example of pernicious racism. Problem with that is virtually every poll has shown that the majority of blacks support photo voter ID. So if it's racism, why is it that blacks support what you consider to be a racist activity? Black people are just as concerned about the integrity of the vote as white people are. The other example he gave for pernicious racism was his assertion that black criminal defendants who commit the same crime as a white criminal defendant will get a sentence longer than the black one. Excuse me, the white sentence will get a shorter sentences than the black one. And it's true. A black criminal defendant who commits crime A compared to a white criminal defendant who commits crime A will have a sentence about 22.5% longer. That's from the U.S. Sentencing Commission, which in his speech, Eric Holder quoted. What he didn't tell you was that the same Sentencing Commission said that during the sentencing phase of a trial, a judge will properly take into consideration the arrest record. And it turns out a typical criminal defendant who's black has a longer arrest record than a typical criminal defendant who's white. And the Sentencing Commission said the reason for the longer sentences is because of, quote, legitimate factors taken into consideration by the judge, end of quote. That part of Eric Holder's speech was left out. The third example he gave was the fact that in any given school, black kids are kicked out or suspended proportionately more than the white kids at that given school, which is also true. And some years ago, Jesse Jackson made the same argument when the school board, all white, in Decatur, Illinois, kicked out hundreds of black kids who were fighting after a football game. Turns out the black kids collectively had missed hundreds of days of school. They were involved in gang activity, but in comes Jackson, filed a lawsuit accusing the school of excessively punishing these kids and accused the school board of racism. The school board countered by noting that irrespective of the racial composition of the school board all around the country, whether it's the school board of Oakland, where most of the school board members are people of color, or an all-white school board such as Decatur, it turns out black boys are kicked out at a higher percentage compared to their student body percentage than the white kids are. It has to do with behavior. The number one problem facing the black community, I would say the number one problem facing America, is the growing number of kids who are raised without fathers. "73% today of black kids are raised without fathers." I was a freshman in college in 1970. We read a book called The Negro Family, A Case for National Action, written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's a Democrat. Later on became a senator from New York. He got hammered for saying that 25% of black kids are raised without fathers. This is a problem that requires national action, and if we don't do something about this, it's going to get worse. And he said there are all sorts of social problems that flow from kids raised without fathers. Fast forward, as I mentioned, now the percentage of black kids raised without fathers is 73%. 50% of Hispanic kids are now raised without fathers. Altogether in America, 40% of kids are raised without fathers. 25% of white kids are now raised without fathers. If 25% of black kids being raised without fathers was alarming in 1965, why isn't 25% of white kids being born outside of wedlock not alarming in 2018? You tell me. My argument is that when Lyndon Johnson launched the so-called war on poverty, he gave an incentive. He incentivized women to marry the government and allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. 50 years later, and some $20 trillion later, look at a graph of the amount of money that we spend on welfare, and look at a graph of the growth of kids raised without fathers, and they parallel each other. We have incentivized women to marry the government, and we're allowing men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. That is a far, far bigger problem than the racism that still remains in America. Pick up a wand. Thank you. Pick up a wand, wave it over America, and remove every smidge of racism in the hearts of white America. You're still going to have the problem that I mentioned about the growing proliferation of kids raised without fathers. One of the top aides to Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, said years ago, in order to escape poverty, you must do three things. Finish high school. Don't have a kid before you're 20. Get married before you have that kid. Follow that prescription. You will not be poor. Don't follow it. There's a very good chance that you will. What does that have to do with racism? We also talked about police practices. This Black Lives Matter movement. Colin Kaepernick, who started it essentially, said the reason he knelt during the national anthem is because black people are being killed all the time and no one's doing anything about it. Killed by the cops all the time and no one's doing anything about it, end of quote. Really. I was honored to be invited to speak before the Ohio State football team by Coach Urban Meyer. He and I follow each other on Twitter, and I get this note from him asking me to call him. My show is carried in Columbus where he is. He says, Larry, I had someone from the Black Lives Matter movement come in to speak to my kids last month. I have a speaker coming in every month. And I'm not going to tell you what my position is, but I know yours is very different. Would you mind coming in to speak to my kids? I can't pay you. You have to come in on your own dime, but we can put you up at the university. And I said, Coach, are you aware I went to Michigan? No kidding. 10-second pause. He said, can you refer to it as the school up north when you come here? He wasn't kidding. I go there, must have been 100 players, 80% of them were black, and they were not having it. They were like this. And I told them what I told you. Take a magic wand, do all this stuff. They weren't hearing it. I said, according to the Washington Post, in 2016, I think it was, approximately 17 unarmed black men were killed by the police. Unarmed does not mean not dangerous. Michael Brown was unarmed, and that they found his DNA on Officer Darren Wilson's gun. He was charging the officer, so just because you don't have a weapon doesn't mean you're not dangerous. But 17 unarmed black men were killed by the police. In any given year, 300 people are injured by lightning in America. Now, lightning, of course, doesn't strike people proportionately by race, but assuming it did, since black men are 7% of the population, 21 black men were injured by lightning in any given year, which means you are more likely to be injured by lightning than to be killed as an unarmed black man by a cop. It is rare for police to kill anybody, let alone an unarmed black person. Twice as many unarmed white people were killed by cops as unarmed blacks, I said. Name one. "250 black men were killed by the police that year. Almost all of them had a weapon, a knife, or resisting arrest. 500 whites were killed by the police. Name one. I think they got the point. If a black person is killed by a cop, especially if it's a white cop, in comes Anderson Cooper, in comes MSNBC, in comes New York Times, in comes CNN. It is a big deal. White person gets killed by a cop, as my mom used to say, he's a dead fly. I recently was in Fresno giving a speech, and weeks before that, a 19-year-old white person had been killed by the police at a gas station. He'd gotten out of a car. He was waving his arms around, resisting commands. Somebody thought he had a weapon. He turned out he didn't. Shot him several times. It was a one-day story. CNN covered it for about one day, and that was it. Done. But it's a black person on and on and on and on. Institutional racism? Really? Michael Brown was killed, as you know, in Ferguson. In comes the DOJ. They do a investigation of the Ferguson Police Department. The grand jury does an investigation, completely exonerates the officer. Never mind Al Sharpton, before one word of testimony had been taken, was in the streets of Ferguson yelling, "No justice, no peace." And they found that the officer had done nothing, but the Obama DOJ concluded that the Ferguson Police Department was plagued by, quote, institutional racism, close quote. The principal finding, Ferguson is 67% black, but the percentage of those who are stopped by the police who are black are 85%, an 18-point gap. Ergo, institutional racism. Really? New York, the population of New York, the black population is 25%. Of those who were stopped by the police, 55% of them were black, a 30-point gap. Yet the NYPD is majority officers of color. Well, why then is the NYPD not considered to be institutional racism, irrespective of the composition of the police department, if in fact the way you determine racism is that there's a disparity between the percentage of the population and the percentage of that population that's stopped by the police? It's nonsense. It's all about behavior. During the Obama administration in 2013, the National Institutes of Justice, which is the research arm of the DOJ, put out a report called Race and Traffic Stops. And it turns out that black motorists were disproportionately stopped compared to white motorists, no question about it. But the NIJ found that 75% of black motorists admitted that they were stopped for a legitimate reason. And it turns out, you name the offense, whether it's speeding, whether it's driving without a license, whether it's driving without proper tags, whether it's driving without a seatbelt, whether it's driving without a car safety seat in the back, a black motorist was more likely to commit the offense than a white motorist. The NIJ concluded that the reasons for the disproportionate stops were for, quote, legitimate factors, end of quote. The report came out, not a whole lot of it on CNN, not a whole lot of it on MSNBC, quietly went away. Some years ago, the state troopers in New Jersey were accused of racially profiling black motorists. The then governor, Christy Todd Whitman, was ordered by the federal government to launch an investigation. She hired a group to find out whether or not this was true. Report came back, no pattern. In fact, a lot of these officers couldn't tell the race of the car because they were going so fast. And what about the sun reflecting on the window? And what about at night when they can't even see the race? She didn't like that study, ordered another one, hired a new firm that used a different methodology, same result. The officers were not engaged in any kind of racism, of any kind of racial profiling, all the factors that I mentioned. Report goes into the drawer, nobody talks about it. Bill Clinton used to talk about environmental racism. The guy that was the leader of the Million Man March helped to arrange it as a guy named Benjamin Chavis. Benjamin Chavis then began talking about institutional racism, environmental racism, meaning that toxic dump sites and junkyards were intentionally placed to black neighborhoods more so than white neighborhoods. So the government did a study. Turns out there were more toxic dump sites near white areas and junkyards near white areas than black areas. So much for the environmental racism nonsense. Do you remember some years ago when USA Today did a whole series of black churches being burned by white racists? Story after story after story. Analysis turns out not a single church was burned over that period of time as a result of racial animus. Some of them were burned because people were setting fires, and some people were setting fires in order to get insurance money, but they couldn't find a single instance in which a black church was burned during this time of hysteria for racial reasons. In fact, more synagogues and mosques were burned during that period of time than were black churches. But there was USA Today pushing this phony narrative, getting people angry. I've often maintained that part of the reason for the black leadership malpractice is because 3 of the most prominent black leaders didn't have good relationships with their own fathers, and I think they're angry. Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson's mom got pregnant by the married man who lived next door. Jesse Jackson grew up in South Carolina in a time when this was unusual to not have a father. And Jesse was taunted, Jesse ain't got no daddy, Jesse ain't got no daddy. Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan's mother was estranged from her husband, had a boyfriend, had taken back up with the estranged husband, got pregnant with Louis, and tried to abort him with a coat hanger. Al Sharpton had a nice middle-class life until his father took off with another woman. Down to the ghetto they go. I argue that part of the reasons these three men can't see the obvious racial progress is because there's some pain somewhere that a shrink needs to address. But the progress is obvious. In 1940, 87% of black people lived below the federally defined level of poverty. 20 years later, 47% were. A 40-point drop in that 20-year period of time. That's the greatest expansion of economic progress for blacks in the history of this country. Notably, that took place before affirmative action, before set-asides, before the war on poverty. People just working hard, getting skills that are of value to the marketplace. My mother grew up in Huntsville, Georgia. And she told me that when she was a little girl, there were two theaters. There was the country theater, and then there was the downtown theater. The country theater had second-run movies that had been out for a while. And you could sit anywhere you wanted in the country theater, which was owned by a white man. The downtown theater had first-run movies, but blacks could only sit in the balcony. Then, for whatever reason, the theater owner in the South began getting first-run movies. All of a sudden, the policy downtown changed like that. No march, no picket, no nothing. That white guy realized if he wanted to not lose black customers, he needed to let them sit anywhere they wanted to sit the same way the Southern guy in the country let the black people sit anywhere they wanted to sit. My mother told me there was a man who could neither read nor write, but he was the best chimney maker in the South. The evidence of a good chimney maker is to build a chimney that does not smoke, and where you finish it, you don't have too many bricks. You haven't ordered too many. The idea is to order just as many, otherwise you've wasted and had to pay too much. This guy was able to design a chimney that did not smoke and was able to figure out how many bricks he needed to the point where he might only end up with 3 more than he needed. He was always employed, always by whites, because they wanted to have the best. Booker T. Washington said in his book called Up From Slavery, which was written in 1901, 36 years after slavery, and he was born a slave. Whenever a Negro boy learns how to cook, sew, wash dishes, or practice medicine as well or better than anybody else, he or she will be rewarded without regard to race. People want the best, he said. There are at least 2 studies that show that the police are more reluctant, more hesitant to use force against a black suspect than a white suspect. One of those studies was a study that was published in the New York Times, written about in the New York Times, by a Harvard economist named Roland Fryer, who is a tenured professor at Harvard. I'm told he obtained his tenureship faster than any professor in the history of Harvard. He happens to be a brilliant black guy. And he said that the reason he decided to find out whether or not the police were unfairly using deadly force against black people is because of all the shootings he's been hearing about. Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland. And he thought there was a proliferation of them he wanted to find out. He said the findings were the most shocking of his professional career. He found out that cops were more hesitant, more reluctant to pull the trigger on a black suspect than a white suspect. Possibly and probably because there would be bigger consequences, a fear of being accused of racism. In comes the civil rights community, in comes the NAACP, in comes Anderson Cooper. I have a lot of friends who are cops, and they tell me whenever there's a shooting, the first thing they say amongst themselves is, I hope it wasn't a black guy. What does that sound like to you? The idea that the police are routinely engaging in racial profiling has not been borne out by the data. If you have something that shows the contrary, give it to me. What you get is emotion. What you get is somebody talking about their personal experience. We've all had personal experiences. Hell, I could talk about that. Nobody got stopped more by the cops than I did. I am now 6 foot tall, but when I got my driver's license at the age of 16, I was really short and really skinny, and when I took driver training, they put a pad underneath the seat for me to sit because I was so, and I have long legs, I got a short torso even now. My girlfriend is about right here. We sit on those 2 chairs, she's higher than I am. So I've always had this issue. But of course, people laugh at you when you put a pillow on, so I'm not gonna do that. Somebody in the neighborhood might see that. So I got stopped when I was 16 to maybe 17 and a half, probably about 100 times by the police. And every time, I'm sorry, I stopped you because you looked too young to be driving. Only one time was anybody arguably rude, and I think I deserved it. It was the first time I was stopped. I'm driving down Western Avenue. I see some lights in a car flashing behind me. I know I hadn't done anything wrong, so I kept going. I went through one light, went through two lights, car pulls over. God damn it, get over! I pull over. Why didn't you pull over? I said, I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I didn't think the lights were for me. He said, next time, get your head out of your ass and pay attention. And he left. Oh, come on. Is that like a crime? I did have my head in my ass. I should have pulled over. Don't ask me why I didn't. I really didn't think I'd done anything wrong. The idea is when the officers are behind you and they're flashing lights, you pull over. My father told me when I'm pulled over by the police, say yes, sir, say no, no, sir. Put your left hand at 10 o'clock, your right hand at 2 o'clock. Make sure your paperwork is in order. If you feel you were treated badly, get the officer's badge number, and you and I will deal with it while we are both alive. If you look at the men who've been killed by the police, Eric Gardner was the one who was selling Lucy's in New York. The idea that somebody who sells Lucy's should be a focus of police attention is absurd, but it's because of the high bureaucracy in New York. They need to have the tax revenues that they're losing from cigarette sales, so in their opinion, it's something that's worth going after. But he resisted. Tamir Rice was the 12-year-old who was twirling the gun in Cleveland. Had removed the little pink sticker at the end of the gun that law requires so that people can distinguish a toy gun from a real gun. And the guy called 911, said, this guy is scaring the blank out of people, please come here. 4 investigations, all 4 said the officer used legitimate force. Freddie Gray, for crying out loud. This is a guy who was in the police van and apparently wasn't tethered properly or whatever, and he ended up smashing his head and dying. 6 officers were tried. 3 of them were black. By the way, Baltimore is about 45% black. The city council was 100% Democrat, majority black. At the time, the mayor was black. The number 1 and number 2 heads of the police department, black. The state attorney who brought the charges against the 6 officers, black. The U.S. Attorney General at the time, black. The president, black. And we're talking about institutional racism? When blacks are running the institution? Scotty, beam me up. And there were 3 trials, 3 non-convictions. 2 of the trials were before a black judge who found the officers not guilty. It's a lie, and it hurts people. It's doing damage. It's not just it's false, it's doing damage. How's the damage? Officers are pulling back. They're becoming more and more passive. Even Rahm Emanuel admitted it in Chicago. He said the officers, because they're afraid of being accused of racism, are balling themselves up into a fetal position. He said this. You're doing damage. Some years ago, the head of the NAACP, Kwesi Mfume, came to Cincinnati and was yelling and screaming about the spate of black men who had been injured by the cops. There had been 11, 15 or so in a certain period of time. Every single one of them was justified. A couple of them were on the gray area, but that's about it. He comes in, stands on the car with a bullhorn, yelling and screaming about the cops being racist this and racist that. And then, of course, he goes back to his comfortable home. Meanwhile, the people living in that area of Cincinnati saw an increase in crime because the police became more passive. The police will police as aggressively or as passively as the community wants them to. They're getting paid. If you don't want me to do anything, you don't want me to be proactive, I won't be proactive. So they weren't. Crime went up. So it's doing damage to the very people that the Black Lives Matter people claim that they care about. It's nonsense. When Jesse Williams, that actor, gave that 4-minute rant at BET about cops killing people all the time, no consequences, I contacted him through social media. I said, come on my show. Let's have a debate. Let's have a fact-based debate about what you said. I wrote 2 columns about him. I said, where are the fact checkers when you want them? Where's the fact check people? You said at least 20 or 30 things that were just flat out false. Wouldn't come on. I don't blame him. William F. Buckley once said, when asked after 33 years of firing line why a certain left-wing politician didn't come on, he says, why does the bologna avoid the grinder? But he wouldn't come on. As I said before, the biggest problem far and away in this country is the growing number of kids born outside of wedlock. I'm intrigued by people like Coach Popovich in San Antonio, who has spoken out about the racism he believes remains in the country. My show is carried in San Antonio, so they hear me there. And I said, I was reading an article in Sports Illustrated some years ago. The cover had a little black boy holding a basketball, and it said, "Where's my daddy?" Turns out, for every one player in the NBA who does not have a kid outside of wedlock, there is a player who has two. That is a far bigger problem, Coach, than the alleged police racism that you are so empathetically concerned about. Why don't you do something about that? My last book was called Dear Father, Dear Son, 2 Lives, 8 Hours. And it's about the 8-hour conversation I had with my father when I was 25 years old. I despised my father growing up. I have 2 brothers. We all felt the same way. I thought my dad was ornery. I thought he was ill-tempered. I thought he was quick to anger. I thought he spanked us too hard, too often, and for reasons I didn't think were warranted. Unfortunately, my dad starts a small cafe when I'm 10 years old, so we all have to work for him. I hated working for my father. He was demanding. He often would explode and would drop F-bombs in front of people. It's a little diner now. You're talking about 18 seats, so everybody can hear it when he's yelling at me. Now I'm 15 years old. I would like to tell you that I went up to my dad and I said, "Now see here, pal, it's mano a mano time. We're going to have a talk about how you treat me." But I was afraid of my father. I would never have said that to him. But I did tell myself the next time he yells at me, I'm going to walk out of the cafe and act with defiance that nobody ever did to my dad. So he yelled at me. I'm 15 years old, went in the back, took off my apron. I walked out. My dad came home that night. He was steamed. "Why did you leave?" I said, "I got sick and tired of the way you spoke to me." My dad paid me $10 a day plus tips. He balled up the $10, he threw it at me as I lay on the bed, and he walked out of my room, and he and I did not speak for 10 years. And when I say did not speak for 10 years, I mean did not speak for 10 years. He worked long hours. It was easy to avoid him until I graduated from high school. I went to college in the East, law school in the Midwest. I ended up working in the Midwest in Ohio. And of course, I would come home from time to time, but I would always avoid my father so we wouldn't have to say anything. We didn't speak for 10 years. Now I'm 25 years old. I had just passed the California, Ohio bars, just graduated from Michigan Law School, got a job with a major law firm. I was making the equivalent of $150,000. I'm 25 years old. I should be living large. I can't sleep. And the reason I can't sleep is because I'm thinking about my father. And I knew we would never be friends, but I figured I needed to do something so I could sleep. So I called my secretary. I said, "Cancel all my appointments. I'm flying to LA. I didn't want my parents to know that I was coming. I didn't want my dad to prepare for this summit, which I thought was going to last 5 or 10 minutes. So I walk into the cafe at 1:30. The cafe closes at 2:30. I had 2 big bags. My dad said, shocked to see me, of course, "Shall I put your bags in the back, Larry?" I said, "No, Dad. I'm only going to be here about 5 minutes. I want to tell you something." He said, "Okay, wait until we close." So I sat there for an hour watching him. I said, "Now, Larry, calm down. Don't tee off on the man. Don't tell him everything he's ever done. Give him the Cliff Notes. Call him an SOB. He'll call you an ungrateful son. 5, 10 minutes, out the door." My dad sat down, and of course, I teed off on him. I told him everything he'd ever done to me, everything he'd ever said to me, every slight, everything. I spoke nonstop for 20 minutes. You guys know how I can go. And my dad sat there, 2 stools this far apart, and took it. And just took it. And finally, I was done. 20, 25 minutes, I was out of ammo. I couldn't think of anything else to say. And my dad said, "Is that it? You didn't speak to me for 10 years because of that?" And I said, "Yeah." For the first time, I saw my father cry. I did not think the man had the ability to summon tears. He said, let me tell you about my father. Elder is not the name of my father. First time hearing this. I said, he's not your biological father? He said, no. I said, who is? I don't know. My mother, he said, was illiterate, had a series of boyfriends, each one more irresponsible than the one before. Elder was just the man who was in my life the longest, which is why I took his name. He was out of my life years ago. His mom had a series of boyfriends after Elder, each one more irresponsible than that. My dad comes home at the age of 13, starts quarreling with his mom's then boyfriend. She sides with the boyfriend, throws my father out of the house, never to return. A 13-year-old black boy, Athens, Georgia, in the heart of the Jim Crow South at the beginning of the Great Depression. I defy you to find very many people with a hand dealt like that. So over 8 hours, my dad and I are talking about his life. And I said, well, what did you do? I walked down the road. I took any job I could get. Ultimately, he became a Pullman porter on the trains. They were the largest private employer of blacks in those days. My dad was able to travel all around the country. And California, wow, it was sunnier. And people seemed less racist. My dad made a mental note that maybe someday I'll relocate to California, to LA. Pearl Harbor. My dad joins the Marines. He was a Montford Point Marine. People know who the Tuskegee Airmen are, but most people don't know who the Montford Point Marines are. They were the first black Marines. 20,000 of them from 1942 to 1949 at a camp near what's now Camp Lejeune. Thank you. My dad was stationed in Guam, where he became a staff sergeant, was promoted 4 times, in charge of cooking facilities. My dad can look at a cake and tell you what's in it. He goes back to Chattanooga, where he had met and married my mom when the war was over. He goes to restaurant to restaurant to restaurant to get him a job as a short order cook, and he's told, I'm sorry, we don't hire niggers. He goes to an unemployment office. Lady says, I'm sorry, you went through the wrong door. My dad goes out to the hall, sees colored, goes to that door to the very same lady who sent him out. My dad went home to my mom and said, this is BS. I'm going to Los Angeles, where I was a few years ago. I'm going to get me a job as a short order cook. After a couple of days, I'll send for you. He goes out to LA, walks around restaurant to restaurant to restaurant, and they tell him, sorry, you have no references. My dad said, I'm a vet. I cook for hundreds of GIs. You want references? My dad said, I'll work for free for 2 weeks. If you like what I do, give me a reference. If you don't, don't. They wouldn't even do that. He was treated the same way in LA as he was in Chattanooga. They were just more polite about it. Goes to the unemployment office, one door this time. They had nothing. My dad said, what time do you open? She said, 8:30. What time do you close? 5 o'clock. My dad said, tomorrow morning I'll be here at 8:30. I'll be here until 5 o'clock until you find something. My dad sat in that chair literally for a day and a half. Lady calls him up and says, I've got something. I don't know whether or not you're going to want it. He says, I'm sure I'm going to want it. What is it? She says, it's a job cleaning toilets at Nabisco brand bread. My dad took that job for 10 years, took a second job cleaning toilets at a company called Barbara Ann Bread, cooked for a family on the weekends, didn't make additional money, and went to night school 2 or 3 nights a week to get his GED. The man never slept. Now, you come home to a house with 3 rambunctious boys without any sleep, having work like that, and see what kind of mood you are in. And as he's telling me this, my dad is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I am getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And now I'm crying. And I said, Dad, I am so sorry. I didn't know. He said, I know you didn't. Don't blame yourself. Just follow the instructions I've always given your brothers and you. Hard work wins. You get out of life what you put into it. You cannot control the outcome, but Larry, you are 100% in control of the effort. And before you bitch, moan, and whine about what somebody did to you, go to the nearest mirror, look at it, and say, what could I have done to change the outcome? And finally, Larry, no matter how good you are, how hard you work, sooner or later, bad things will happen. How you respond to those bad things will tell your mom and me whether or not we raised a man. Now you can applaud. Thank you. To which I'd always say, not too much pressure, Dad. My mother was raised on a farm in Huntsville, Alabama. And for her to have a farm that her family owned meant she was almost like royalty. So the contrast between my mom and my dad's background, almost night and day. My mom had 1 year of college, and for a black woman, 1 year of college is like having a PhD. When you went home somewhere off to school and came back, nobody asked you if you had a 4-year degree. They just know that you went and you came back educated. So my mother was perceived to be educated. My dad, of course, as I mentioned, 8th grade education until he got his GED. My mom always told my brothers and me, the way up is education, education, and oh, by the way, education. I remember us going through an illustrated book of all the presidents, from George Washington to the then incumbent Dwight Eisenhower. Went over every single one of them, what they've done, what they didn't do, what they should have done, what they should have done. And she said, Larry, someday, if you want it badly enough, you can be in this book. I never wanted to be president, anything I ever aspired to do, but from that moment on, I knew that if that's what I wanted to do, I had the ability to make it happen. My parents gave me the fundamental thing that you can give a child, and that's, I think Dr. Laura put it, roots and wings, and I was blessed to have had them. My parents refused to allow my brothers and me to think of ourselves as victims. She said, you're not a victim. My father said, the door is now wide open. I only wish I had had the opportunities that you have in your generation. Don't squander it. And I think that the Democratic Party does the country a disservice with people like Maxine Waters and the entire Congressional Black Caucus and people like Joe Biden saying things to a predominantly black audience in 2012 as he did. He was criticizing Mitt Romney for not wanting additional regulations on Wall Street. And he told Joe Biden, a majority black audience, what Romney wants to do is unchain Wall Street, wants to put y'all back in chains. How condescending and insulting is that? Want to put y'all back in chains. All of a sudden, he's Malcolm X. Hillary Clinton, when she was a senator, was addressing a black church, and she was criticizing the Republican-controlled House. And she said, they're running this place like a plantation, and you know what I'm talking about. How utterly insulting. Claire McCaskill, when she first ran for Senate of Missouri, she said, George W. Bush let people die on rooftops in New Orleans because they were poor and because they were black, end of quote. Nobody died on rooftops in New Orleans. It was a lie. Barney Frank accused George W. Bush of intentionally not aggressively responding to Hurricane Katrina because he wanted the French Quarter to be flooded and blacks to leave Louisiana, and therefore assuring Louisiana of remaining a red state in perpetuity. That's what Barney Frank said, and he accused George W. Bush of, quote, ethnic cleansing by inaction, end of quote. What the hell is that? What is that? What have you done? What are you doing to people? How is that helping things? It's not. It's making things worse, but it's giving you votes. 95% of black people have pulled the lever for the Democratic Party for a very long period of time. What binds them together? The majority of inner city parents want vouchers. They want choice. I went to a school called Crenshaw High School. If you saw the movie Boys in the Hood, that's my high school. Right now, 3% of kids can do math at grade level. That's not a typo, 3%. Now, if you're living within a geographical radius of that school, you are mandated to send your kid to a school where only 3% of kids can do math at grade level. That is why the majority of inner city parents want choice. Republicans want to give them choice. Democrats don't. But they pull the lever for the Democratic Party. Explain that to me. However you feel about illegal immigration, there are numerous studies that show unfettered illegal immigration, especially unskilled illegal immigration, poses competition to jobs and puts downward pressure on wages for those living in the inner city. The Republican Party wants to do something about this. Democratic Party does not, because in my opinion, the Democratic Party wants porous borders because eventually there'll be pressure on politicians to make these illegal aliens become citizens, become voters. There's a YouTube video you can see of a man named Elacio Medina, who is the executive VP of the SEIU union, one of the largest unions. And he said, if 10 to 12 million people become citizens, the majority of them are going to vote for progressive candidates. We're going to have a governing coalition, a majority governing coalition for the long haul. He was blatant about it. It wasn't like it was a secret. I've maintained that if illegals turn citizens, turn voters, would likely vote 80% Republican, the borders would be shut tighter than the clams behind. And it would have happened a long time ago. I mentioned that my mother and father refused to allow us to think the way so many people are thinking right now, the Colin Kaepernicks, the Black Lives Matter people. I was in high school taking a black literature course, and we read a poem by a man named Countee Cullen. And it went like this. While riding through old Baltimore, so small and full of glee, I saw a young Baltimorean keep a looking straight at me. Now, I was young and very small, and he was no whit bigger, and so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. Well, the teacher was furious. The class was furious. We talked about the permanent stain to this kid's psyche, that he'll always be branded as a second-class citizen, how this is going to damage his future. Teacher was mad. Class was mad. I was mad. I came home. I knew my mom was going to have a different take on it. I didn't know what it was going to be, but I knew it was going to be different. I said, Mom, we read this poem in class. She said, yeah? I said, it's by a guy named Countee Cullen. I said, I want to get your reaction to it. She said, go ahead. While riding through a Baltimore so small and full of glee, I saw a young Baltimorean keep a looking straight at me. Now, I was young and very small, and he was no whit bigger, and so I smiled, but he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. My mom took the spoon out of the pot, hit it on the side, turned to me and she said, Larry, what a damn shame he let something so trivial spoil his vacation. How many wings do you want? Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it. God bless you, and may God continue to bless the United States of America. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Much love. Thank you very much.